And now, without any more taking of time, on to our first witnesses together, who wish to be known as...
Colin and Denise, sir.
Please.
Please state your full name.
Denise and Turton.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name.
Colin George Turton.
Please take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Colin and Denise, you're here to give evidence about what happened to your son Lee. Your daughter Kerry sits with you. Prior to the inquiry, you've not spoken publicly about Lee before, is that right?
That's right, yes.
But you felt you wanted to come and explain what happened to Lee.
Yes, we did. It's the last chance.
Lee was born in 1981 and he was the first of your 4 children.
Yes.
And he was diagnosed with haemophilia A when he was a baby. How did that come about?
At 6 months old, he was having... he was crying a lot with one of his hips. So we called the local GP out, who they do the hip test on him, sent him to hospital, and because they couldn't find anything wrong with him. And they kept him in for a week.
It must have been a week.
A week, because they obviously thought we'd hurt him. So every morning we would go in, we were called into the little room to be asked if, what was home life like. Well, after a week, they'd done a blood test on him, and his arm came up like a big balloon, and that's when they realised that he had haemophilia.
And what were you told about the severity of his haemophilia?
He was mild.
But later on, you were informed that his haemophilia was more than mild, was severe.
He was severe, yes.
Now, Lee's care until 1989 was at Bristol, is that right?
Yes.
And he was under the care of Dr. Berman until 1987.
Yes.
The treatment that Lee initially received for his haemophilia was cryoprecipitate when he was a baby.
Yes, he did.
And you would go to hospital for him to receive that treatment?
Yes. I don't think he had many treatments with the cryo, but yes, we always went to the hospital for it.
That changed to factor 8 products when Lee was still a baby in about early 1982.
Yeah.
What were you told was the reason for the switch from cryoprecipitate to factor 8?
Factor 8 is, it would be easier because the cryo took so long to go in, so the factor 8 would be easier with a small child to get into him.
And I think it's right, Colin, you say in your statement that you were also told that cryoprecipitate would no longer be available.
That's correct, yes.
And we can see that from one of the documents. Paul, could we have on screen, please, 1575012? And we can see the very bottom entry. This is a later entry from Lee's medical records, 1985. But the last 2 lines say, swapped from cryo to factor 8 around 1982 because cryo not available. Were you given, either of you, and I think you used to attend the consultations together for the most part, were you given any information or advice or warnings about any risks of infection from the factor 8 products?
No.
Had you been told there was any risk of infection with a virus to Lee, what would you have done?
We wouldn't have given him the factor 8.
The products which Lee received were NHS Factor VIII products as far as you're aware.
Yes.
And we can see that from a couple of documents. Paul, could we have up on screen, please, 1574002? So 1574. Thank you. That's it. And we can see this is a letter from the Avon Health Authority a number of years later, November 1997. The main paragraph says, I enclose for your attention a schedule of the cryoprecipitate and factor VIII administered to Lee Turton between 1982 and March 1985. I'm advised that all of this material was NHS product and none of it was commercial of American origin. I'm also advised that this material was not heat-treated, as heat-treated NHS products were not available until April 1985. And then if we go to the next page, please, Paul. We can see the schedule referred to. We see there it's suggested, if we go towards the top of the page, please, Paul. Under NHS Factor VIII, it suggested there that the first date that Lee received it was March 1982, but in fact his records show that he received Factor VIII first in January 1982. Yeah. And we can see that all the products listed there are NHS Factor VIII. Yes. Those projects were all administered at Bristol, with, I think, one exception when Lee was treated elsewhere.
Torbay.
And Colin, your statement says, as far as you know, that, again, it was NHS product that he received that one occasion in Torbay in 1984. Now, you both recall, as I understand it, becoming generally aware of news reports about AIDS and the possibility of it affecting the haemophilia community. And you spoke to Lee's consultant, Dr. Berman, and asked him if there were any risks to Lee. What did he tell you?
He told us that Lee was only having British Factor VIII, so there was no risk. He wasn't having imported American Factor VIII. And he did say all the children were getting British Factor VIII.
You don't, I think, recall when that conversation was, but it was before Lee was diagnosed.
Yes.
Now, in the course of 1985, when Lee was 4 years old, you were called into the hospital to see Dr. Berman to be told of Lee's diagnosis with what we would now call HIV. We'll look at some records in a moment, but first of all, what can both of you recall about that meeting?
We were called in. I can remember going into the room, and it was Dr. Berman, and there was another doctor in there. And I can remember he stood by the doorway, the other doctor, and I'm not sure if it was Dr. Oakhill or not. And he just told us they'd had a discussion. This is Dr. Berman. They'd had a discussion between all of them, and they weren't going to tell us, but they decided they would tell us that Lee was HIV positive.
You are both critical in your statements of the manner in which that news was broken to you and what you've described as the attitude of the doctor. You've described it as arrogant in your statements. Is that right?
Yes, he was very arrogant. He was the professional person, and you knew he was a professional. He always came across as, I'm in charge.
Can you recall what, if anything, you were told about the prognosis for Lee at that time?
We weren't actually told much at all. That day, he told us, we asked, because I was angry at the time, and I did shout at him saying, you told us it was British Factor VIII, why has this happened? And he said, if you've got any more questions, he went towards the door to open the door and said, if you've got any more questions, make an appointment to come back and see us. And we also, before we went, we said we wanted it kept private.
Were you given any practical advice on managing Lee's haemophilia in light of this news?
None.
No.
Were you given any advice on possible risks to yourself or to Kerry, who was about 2 years old at the time?
No.
Had you known prior to that meeting that Lee was being tested for HIV?
No. not at all.
Now, in your statements, you've suggested that Lee was diagnosed in March 1985, but that you weren't told until August 1985. You didn't have the benefit of all of the medical records there, and we've since looked at the medical records, and we can see that it's likely that you were told in June 1985, and I think you accept that.
Yes.
But we'll just try and look at some of the documents and try and get some of the dates as part of your evidence. If we have up on screen, please, Paul, 1574002. This is the letter we've already looked at, but if we can look at the last paragraph of the letter, it says this: Lee Turton was known to be HIV negative in February 1984 and was found to be HIV positive on the 8th of March 1985. That gives the date on which Lee first tested positive for HIV as being the 8th of March 1985. If we can then have up on screen, please, Paul, 1575004. We can see here again, it's a later letter, but it says that Lee was first found to be HIV positive in March 1985. The previous September, he was negative. So the window within which Lee was infected is roughly some point from the autumn of 1984 to the spring of 1985.
Yeah.
The March 1985 test results are not in Lee's medical records. And I think it's right, you've had some difficulty obtaining Lee's medical records. What happened when you tried to get them?
Go for it.
The medical records, we did apply for them, but obviously they just don't want to send them out. We had to wait so long for them. But we also applied, is it the GP records from the PCSE? We waited 11 months, and that was only because we asked our solicitors, and they had to do it. They sent it. We sent it off, done what we had to do, and we had a letter back to say they were dealing with it. We'd had to wait the 40 days, give them the 40 days. We kept phoning them back up, and they kept saying they were with the clinician. And every time we phoned, they were with the clinician, but they could not contact the clinician. And then we had a letter through to say they either wanted a grant of probate or his last will and testament for the child.
How old was Lee when he
10.
died?
Because I phoned him up and I said, he's 10. And they said, you have to do one of them.
And when you were trying to get his medical records, that was when? Was that a long time ago or was that recently?
Last September.
So we don't have the March 1985 test result. There is one from early May of 1985, a positive HTLV3 result. But if we look next at 1575008, please, Paul. We can see here... Oh, can we take that down, please? Sorry, there's a name of someone else that's not been redacted. I'm going to read out the relevant parts of the letter. Okay, so this is a letter that was sent by Dr. Daly to Dr. Berman, 31st of May 1985, and it says this: Dear Dr. Berman, I enclose the results of the anti-HTLV3 antibody testing on the haemophiliac children. As you will note, both Lee Turton, who was a mildly affected factor VIII deficient patient, and another child who is a severely affected factor VIII deficient patient, are both anti-HTLV3 positive. These patients are now high-risk patients. I would be grateful if you could see them and counsel them and their parents appropriately. As they are so young, the main problem with these patients will be in the injection of factor VIII concentrate to them, which would put the parents, or whoever the administrator is, at slight risk of contamination, and they obviously ought to wear gloves. Denise, you looked after Lee full-time, but you looked after him in particular when he had a bleed,
Yes.
and you had a 2-year-old toddler at home. Were you and Colin told of the need to wear gloves?
No.
The letter continues, if you want, I can arrange for the parents of both these children to be tested. I'm going to look through their records to see whether or not these children ever received commercial factor VIII concentrate or whether they were in fact contaminated by British factor VIII concentrate. I will let you know the results of this. I regret to have to give you what must really be tragic results in the light that these samples were taken prior to the commencement of heat-treated British factor VIII concentrate. So that's the letter Dr. Daly wrote to Dr. Berman, 31st of May 1985. If we have up on screen, please, Paul, 1575006. We'll just look, this is a later letter, November 1988, to Dr. Daly again, but we'll just look at the last sentence, please. It's almost certain that he, that's Lee, acquired his HIV infection from one particular batch of NHS concentrate just prior to the introduction of heat treating. Now, if we then have up on screen, please, 1575010. This is a letter of the 14th of June 1985. We just look at the second page, please, Paul. We can see it's from a Dr. Donaldson, Senior Registrar to Dr. Berman. We go up to the top of the page, please. The first page. We can see it's a letter to the GP. It's dated the 14th of June 1985, and I think you now accept that this is, in all likelihood, when you were first told of Lee's infection.
Yes.
It says this: I saw Lee's parents recently following a report from the laboratory that he's positive to HTLV3 virus. This retrovirus is, as you know, implicated in the cause of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. Whereas a significant number of homosexual subjects who've raised antibodies in the HTLV3 virus go on to get clinical AIDS, the risk appears to be far lower in the haemophilia population. To date, there are 5,000 haemophiliacs in the UK, approximately 50% of whom are antibody positive to HTLV3. Only 4 cases of AIDS have been described in haemophiliacs in the UK and a comparable number in the USA. And then it says this: the chance of Lee developing AIDS is therefore extremely small, and I stress this to his parents. Do you recall that information being given to you? That you were told that it was unlikely he'd develop AIDS? And then if we carry on with the letter, please. It says he's obviously met the virus through receiving human factor VIII pooled from multiple donors. But from now on, there should be no further exposure since the factor VIII obtained is British, not American. Can we go back to the top of that page, please, Paul? Thanks. And is heat treated. And then we see a reference to the importance of wearing needles. As a precaution, the haematologists recommend, wearing gloves, that anyone taking blood from or administering blood products, I'm sorry, can we take that down? So we've got the wrong name in there again.
Yeah.
But in any event, it's a letter that's being written about you, and it's got the name of the other child in there who was not yours. But it was, again, a reference to the importance of wearing gloves, and you were not told that either. And then if we can have one final letter up, please, 1575012. No, 1575, please, 012. Sorry, my apologies. It's the third page of that. So it's that reference. Thank you. This is a letter. We go down to the last page, thank you. 22nd of July 1985, and this is from Dr. Berman, who you remember having the conversations with. I saw the parents of Lee Turton in outpatients here on the 16th of July. It says, however, it's now known that at least half the haemophiliacs in the country have this virus, yet very few of them have AIDS. It refers to him giving you the analogy of polio. Do you recall that? Any discussion about an analogy with polio?
I think there was actually, yes.
And then it says in the next paragraph that we really do not know the significance of the finding. Quite clearly, it's worrying for them. I pointed out the low risks. I've told them there's no point in worrying about things as we did not know what to do about it at the moment. But if in the future there is some change in policy, we'll be the first to let them know. I hope I've been reassuring, but I've told them that honestly I cannot promise that Lee will not get AIDS. Other than the meetings that we've seen described in these two letters in June and July 1985, do you recall any other meetings in which you were given advice or information about how Lee's illness might develop?
No, never. They always used to say, you know as much as we know.
And Lee was only 4 when you had this news, and you didn't tell him because of his young age. Just tell us a little what he was like at that age as a 4-year-old boy.
Yeah, you go for it. Bright.
Go on.
He was a bright, intelligent child, was joking, always joking, wasn't he?
Yeah, happy little boy.
Yeah, happy little going boy.
When was it that he started to become unwell?
Yeah, about 86.
86.
He started really going downhill.
You've described in your statements he started to lose energy.
Yeah, so he would get tired. He didn't want to eat, does he?
No.
He was just not himself. He was just really, really low. Just wanted to go to bed.
And in about 1988, your statements suggest he started to acquire a number of infections. And the impression your statements give is that he was never really well after that.
No.
There's one further letter I want to put on screen, and you've seen it this morning. It's 1575009, please, Paul. It's dated the 21st of December 1987, so Lee's was not well by this time, but before he'd started developing the serious infections you describe in your statements. It's written by a locum consultant paediatrician to a senior medical officer with the DHSS, and it says this. Lee's acquired from one of his batches of factor 8 HTLV3 positive status. He is asymptomatic at present, but will sooner or later develop full-blown AIDS syndrome from which he will die. Were you ever told that?
No.
When Lee was about 7, he was started on AZT. What can you tell us about that?
They told him about his virus because we had to tell him, because he obviously, the AZT and AIDS and everything was on the news. And he wasn't stupid. He knew something was wrong. So he was told why he was taking AZT. And we tried to do it as basic as we possibly could. And from then, he just went downhill, didn't he?
Yeah.
He just went downhill so quick. He was on a very high dose of AZT.
And you were particularly worried about the high dose.
Yes.
You knew of another child who was HIV positive being treated at the same hospital, also a haemophiliac, who was not receiving AZT at all.
Yes.
And as I understand it, that led you to question whether Lee was being given AZT for the purpose of research.
Yes.
In April 1989, you moved to Cornwall. Lee transferred to the care of Dr. Daly at the Royal Cornwall Hospital. What was it that led to that move?
We'd had when Lee started school in 85, and somebody had leaked it to the school, but I don't know if it was the school that it had been leaked to, that they'd leaked it to the press that Lee was starting school and he was HIV positive. So we'd had a lot of problems with the press. Parents didn't want him at the school. There was a teacher at the school that wouldn't teach him. Sorry.
You take your time.
Sorry. Yeah, we had the press knocking on the door and banging on the windows when they were small. And the school would phone up and say the press were outside the school, so I'd have to go and get him and take him out the back entrance. Parents wouldn't stand by you. He wasn't invited to friends. He wasn't invited to parties, which was very hard because not only for him, for Kerry as well, because they were both at school. So we decided, once he started on AZT and he started getting worse, we decided to move in the area to give him a childhood the best we could, without nobody knowing who he was.
And Kerry's described in her statement her recollection as a child of having to keep the curtains closed in your house because of the press being outside, of having to go in via the back entrance to school escorted by a teacher because of the press, and press knocking at the door. In terms of Lee's own schooling, Denise, you've said in your statement that it was really a very isolating experience for Lee at school.
Yes, very.
Your statements describe, after the move to Cornwall, Lee's physical deterioration and ill health. What is it you feel able to tell us about that? Take it from your statements if you would prefer.
He's,
Eyesight, his chest.
he couldn't walk far, he couldn't breathe, he couldn't eat, he was fed eventually through a tube. He had intermittent where he couldn't hear, and then some days he couldn't see properly. He had a bloated stomach. It was just infection after infection. We spent most of the time in hospital, in and out of hospitals with him, and they could never find out what was wrong with him, what infection it was, or they didn't tell us what it was.
And he would stay awake at night.
Yes,
He'd have night sweats.
yes.
He was frightened.
He would say, "I'm frightened."
He was in pain, and you'd take it in turns to sit up with him and try and give him reassurance through the night.
Yeah.
You'd largely tried to keep his illness, particularly after the move to Cornwall and what had happened with the press, where you previously lived private, because of the stigmatising effect of AIDS. But one consequence of that and of your move to Cornwall was that you yourselves as a family felt
Obviously.
alone.
Yeah.
You didn't have relatives and friends around.
No,
to
we didn't
support
have
you.
support.
Lee's health continued to get worse. And on the 12th of January 1992, Denise, you found Lee on the bathroom floor fitting.
He was fitting, yeah.
What happened after that?
He was continuously fitting, so we called the ambulance out because we'd gone to stay with Colin's mum and dad at the time, so we were at their house in Bristol. So the ambulance took him to the Children's Hospital in Bristol. They took him off for a scan, but they didn't tell us the result. And Lee wanted to go home, so we insisted that he went back to Cornwall because that's where he wanted to go. So they took him back in an ambulance, and he drove back in the car, and Kerry stayed with our in-laws.
Yeah.
And then when we got back to Cornwall, they actually told us he had between, we called us in, didn't they?
Yeah.
2 and 10 days to live. Sorry. So he said an infection on the brain. So we insisted that he went home that day because that's what he wanted to do. He kept asking to go home. So we took him home. They didn't want him to go home.
No.
They sent out a nurse with us. And in the next few days, we were told we couldn't have him buried. While he was dying, he wouldn't be allowed to be buried because of the virus. You have to be cremated. And he died on the 8th day.
Lee himself told you that he was very frightened.
Yeah,
And he died on the 22nd of January 1992,
yeah,
10 years old. So you've said you were told he couldn't be buried,
yes.
but you insisted.
We insisted. He died on the Wednesday, and we insisted he was being buried. And we found out on the Thursday the vicar would bury him, but it had to be done on the Monday. So we had 2 days to organise a funeral and get relatives and because we got Kerry back early because he was dying. So, you know,
And you felt the whole thing was very rushed.
it was very rushed. You're grieving and you can't. We couldn't do what we wanted to do, funeral-wise. It was just a rush. And you're grieving, you're just not thinking straight.
It was after Lee died that you became aware from his medical record, I think many years after,
Yes,
that he'd also been infected with hepatitis C.
yes, we didn't know.
The impact on both of you of losing your son, you say in your statements, is still, to this day and every day, extremely painful for you both. And when you're asked how many children you have, you sometimes simply say 3 because you don't want to explain what happened to Lee.
It's just easier to
You've both found it hard to trust people and make new friends.
yeah.
You've become very wary. You find it very hard to trust medical professionals.
Definitely,
And you've remained very private
yes.
in the years that have followed. In terms of your own health, you, Denise, have had physical health problems yourself.
Yes.
And you've both been on antidepressants,
Yeah.
which you attribute to the events you've just been telling us about.
Yes.
You also say this in your statement, Colin, that you blame yourselves and each other, and you say, we let it happen.
Yeah, we trusted the professionals, believed in them.
Were either of you ever offered counselling or psychological support?
No.
Was Lee ever offered anything?
No, I think Kerry was once.
Yeah.
You'd given up your job, Colin, for the move to Cornwall. And although you found a new job, you had to give that up because of the amount of time that Lee was in hospital.
They laid me off because I wasn't there, basically.
In 1993, after Lee's death, you moved again to find work. And you've said, Colin, that you have worked, consultancy work, since Lee's death, but you've never felt able to concentrate on your work in the way that you used to be able to.
No.
In terms of the impact upon your other children, Kerry's provided a statement to the inquiry, and she's explained in that after Lee died, she was bullied at school, she was beaten up, and she was told to die like her brother. And she still has flashbacks. And you feel that all your children, Kerry and Robin, who was only a few months old when Lee died, and Jack, who was born after Lee's death, have all been greatly affected. They grew up, those two, not knowing their elder brother.
Yes. And also Jack's severe haemophilia as well.
You had some involvement with the HIV litigation,
Yeah.
and you felt pressured to accept the settlement that was offered. What can you tell us about that?
Lee was ill at the time. He was was 91. He wasn't very well, and we'd been asked to sign the form to say that we would not take anything any further, and we refused. We kept refusing, and then the solicitor kept asking, saying, if you don't sign, you need to sign, because if you don't do it, nobody else will get anything. And in the end, we only had 3 days in which to sign it because we kept saying no. So we signed it because we were told that if we didn't, nobody would get anything. And then they told us afterwards that Lee's money, even though he was dying, would be put in trust till he was 18.
So you weren't able to spend it for his benefit?
We had to go through and fight to say he needed it because we wanted him to have what he wanted, because he died the year after. He was ill and they were putting it in trust.
You had some dealings with the McFarlane Trust, and Colin, you've said in your statement that some payments were received, but all assistance stopped after Lee died.
Definitely true. Yes.
Was there any financial assistance for Lee's funeral?
I think we paid for that, didn't we?
I can't remember paper the stone.
We paid for this. I think we paid for it. I don't think we had any help with anything.
I know they paid for the whole.
It might have been Lee's money.
Might have been.
It might have been Lee's money that we had left.
What was your experience of the application process?
Again, I can't remember.
We used to have to apply, and we used to have to get a quote. We didn't actually have much from them. I think we had a washing machine.
We had a washing machine and sheets.
And
blankets.
sheets because of the night sweats.
Yes.
We didn't actually apply for much at all.
And what Colin said in his statement is that the application process seemed unnecessarily problematic. Whenever we asked for assistance, and if you said that wasn't very often, we had to wait for a very long time to get a response, and then there were meetings to discuss it all the time our son was dying. The application process took ages, and it made us feel like we were begging for money.
Yeah.
And because of that, you didn't apply for help very often, regardless of the fact that you needed it. Those are the questions I have for you. We have a video we're going to play in a moment. But before that, is there anything else either of you would like to say?
I just want to say just a little bit. All I want to say is the pain of reliving what happened to Lee is nothing compared to the pain and suffering he had in his short life. We lost our beautiful son and brother, as did so many parents like Colin and Jan, who lost their little Colin at 7. We listened to MPs shouting about fearing for their safety. Haemophiliacs were fearing for their lives and the safety of the Factor 8 that they were using. The government knew the Factor 8 being used was infected, as did the pharmaceutical companies, and did nothing.
Just before we play the video, I'm going to ask Mr. Snowden if there's anything else he wants to ask. No. Well, could we play Lee's video, please? And I should just say, you wanted me to explain that this is Lee's last Christmas,
Yes.
and he died 4 weeks later.
Because I catch what I thought you were doing there.
Christmas to you. Alright?
Getting a stomachache.
Fella?
Stomachache.
You got a stomachache?
I couldn't get to sleep. The sun was there. It must be too full.
Thank you.
Can I just thank Jason Evans for doing that for us and the factory crew?
Of course. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank you myself. It's obviously so very raw. All the more, I think, says that you have a special something that brings you here to tell us, more or less for the first time, something which is inevitably going to be difficult, particularly for a young lad who was so obviously loved as he was. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll take a break until 25 to 12. If those of you who are downstairs, if you can begin to move up probably 5 minutes before, it avoids the problems of congestion with the lifts. Sorry to be so mundane after what we've just heard.